All right, so today's presentation is about wetlands and groundwater. So starting out, we're first going to talk about wetlands and then end with the groundwater portion of it. So a lot of times when we think of wetlands, we think of just stinky, smelly places where there's mosquitoes and cattails and other things like that. A lot of times we don't think of them as real pleasant places, but wetlands serve a lot of functions and are a great habitat for many different species and a lot of migratory birds and things. So we're going to talk, continue on and talk about what is a wetland and why wetlands are so special. All right, so if you look at wetland, you can break the word up into two parts and see that it stands for wet and land. So basically, it's land that's wet. And wetlands, we've kind of been talking in this series of videos about the water cycle and watersheds, and wetlands are part of the water cycle, being that they hold water, and they're also part of the watersheds. So wetlands are generally low-lying areas or basins that hold water. And the thing with wetlands is they don't necessarily have to be wet all the time. Sometimes they're wet for only a few days. Other times they're or weeks. Other times they hold water for months or even years. But all of those are considered wetlands. All right, so kind of relating wetlands to North Dakota, we live in what's called the Prairie Pothole region. North Dakota is part of the Prairie Pothole region, along with some Canadian provinces and our neighboring states. And we have a lot of wetlands. Sometimes we call them prairie potholes or sloughs, or things like that. But all of those sloughs that we have were created when the glaciers melted and receded probably 20,000 years ago or something like that. So, and this whole area is one of the best waterfall habitats in the world. So a lot of times we don't think of North Dakota as having a real special habitat. We usually associate something like the rainforest or other things, but our prairie potholes and wetlands serve a really important role in the environment. All right, so wetlands are in order to be classified as a wetland, there have to be three characteristics met. So the first characteristic is that it has to have water. And like I said earlier, sometimes it holds water only for a few weeks or a few days. Other times it's for months or years. So, so basically it just has to hold water at some point on a regular basis. And in a little bit, we'll talk about, there are some kind of complex chemical reactions that form when water, when that regular water inundation, when the water interacts with the materials in the soil, it kind of gives soils in wetlands certain characteristics, but I'll get on to that later. So it has to have water. It has to have hydric soil. So, and that is soil that's formed in the presence of water saturation. So, and when soils are saturated with water, that generally means they're very low in oxygen content. So they are called anaerobic. And because of those anaerobic conditions, again, there are only certain types of bacteria and plants that are adapted to live there. And then lastly is hydrophobic plants, or hydrophytic plants, I'm sorry. And those are plants adapted to living in the water. So hydro meaning water, and like phytic meaning loving. So they're water loving plants. All right, so the three things being classified as a wetland: you've got to have water, you have to have soil that has special characteristics, that is formed under anaerobic conditions, and you have to have those hydrophytic plants. All right. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on the wetland vegetation. Like I've been talking about, the dominant plant are those hydrophytes, those plants that have adapted to living in water saturated and low oxygen condition. And if you see that, you can see that kind of cross section of, I think that's a reed there. And you can see there's a lot of open chambers, and that's so that the plant can more easily transport what little oxygen there is there. So, and then the other graphic is just basically showing how different hydrophytic plants are adapted to different water depths. So the plant types change as you get deeper into the wetland, and there are other plants that are that need to be rooted in the bottom. Some other ones are just submerged or don't really even have roots. So they're adapted for wetland living. And this next slide is just kind of similar to the last one, but it just shows how wetlands are a transition zone between the land and the water. So on the right, you can see that's the wetland, and you can see there are the wetland plants. And slowly, as you move upland, the types of plants change. You slowly start getting more cattails, and then as you move upland, the type of plants changes, so that by the time you get fully upland, that's where it supports more trees and terrestrial plants that aren't really adapted to those water saturated conditions. So just kind of a cross section for you to see how habitat transitions between the water saturated zones and the upland area. And again, this next slide is kind of the same thing, just kind of a real life picture. You can see the open water in the center. And if you look real close, you can see a little bit of duckweed and other algae. And then as you move out from the center, you can see cattails and reeds. And as you move into the marsh and wet meadow, you can again see how the plants change until you get into the upland prairie, and that's the prairie plants. So a little bit about hydric soils from wetlands. I'm not going to pretend to be a soil scientist, but I said earlier that the soils in wetlands have undergone certain chemical reactions, so they have certain properties. I'm just touching on it in this presentation because I wanted you to know that how some of these disciplines, this is how one way that aquatics interacts with soils. So again, I'm just going to touch a little bit on it, and if you want more information on that, you'll have to talk to the soils professionals. But essentially, wetland soils are hydric soils that have formed in saturated or flooded areas. They've been flooded long enough to develop those anaerobic oxygen depleted conditions, and the plants that grow there are those hydrophytic plants that have adapted to those conditions. And I just kind of highlighted what anaerobic means. Again, low oxygen, and the microorganisms that exist there can exist there in low to no oxygen, and they'll break down that dead plant material, and as they're doing that, they release certain gases. One of those is the hydrogen sulfide, and that's where, if you've ever been in a wetland and you smell the mucky mud, it smells like sulfur, smells like rotten eggs, and that's the breakdown and decomposition of dead plant material. And the next one is, again, I don't know a lot about that Munsell color book, but I know that's part of what soil scientists use to classify certain types of soils. And I know there are specific pages within that book that they use to determine, to look at when classifying whether or not the soil type meets wetland conditions. So again, just kind of touching on that. All right, so there are certain types of, we call wetlands. Sometimes it just seems like there's just wetlands, and marshes and swamps are synonymous with wetlands, and that's not quite true. Different wetlands are classified based on where they receive their water and what kind of vegetation grow there. So the first one is marshes. Those are the kinds of wetlands that we have mostly in North Dakota. Our prairie potholes are marshes. They mostly have emergent vegetation, and most of their water comes from surface water, although occasionally some are fed by groundwater. Next up is swamps, and the dominant vegetation in a swamp is woody plants and trees. Also, there are bogs. Bogs are fed mostly by precipitation, and they are very spongy, and they have a lot of peat, which is decaying plant material. And those in boggy environments are very, very acidic. And again, they'll only have plants that are adapted to the anaerobic waterlogged conditions, and also highly acidic conditions. So that's a little bit about bogs. Fens are a little bit different. They're similar to bogs, but they're a lot less acidic than bogs are, and they're fed by runoff and groundwater seepage. And we do have fens in North Dakota, but they're mostly found up in the Turtle Mountains of North Dakota. All right, so that's just a little background on wetlands, and we're going to talk about some of the importance of wetlands, why we find wetlands to be important. And so first of all, wetlands are a habitat and a home to many plants, animals, and invertebrates. I think it was last week, we talked about aquatic macroinvertebrates. There are certain ones that are very plentiful in wetlands, and they're an essential part of the food chain. They also help clean up the water because they will eat dead plant material and dead plant and animal material, and kind of help clean up the water. Birds are probably one of the most recognizable, I should say, animals that live in a wetland. North Dakota's wetlands, I said, are some of the most important areas for waterfowl breeding. And because our waterfowl migrate through and nest in North Dakota, these aquatic macroinvertebrates are really important because they provide a high protein food source for nesting birds. All right, and kind of a little interesting tidbit that I found is that some studies indicate that the temporary and seasonal wetlands, those are the wetlands that only hold water for, like in the springtime after snow melt or after heavy rains, they account for about 35% of the wetland area in North Dakota, but they support 57% of the breeding waterfowl population. So very, very important to migratory birds and nesting. Other inhabitants of wetlands are amphibians, reptiles, fish. Of course, a fish would only most likely be found in a permanent wetland like a lake, and mammals. And I've got a little picture of a muskrat, beavers. Those are all wetland animals. Number 2 is flood control. So wetlands, because they're kind of spongy, they're spongy with a lot of that decaying plant material. They act like a sponge, and because they're spongy, they work to control floods. So wetlands store water when the snow melts and after heavy rainfall. And without our wetlands, the water just runs straight into our rivers and streams and contributes to floods. I recently read a news article about the flooding in the Red River Valley, and a big part of the Red River flooding is because all of our natural wetlands have been either drained for agriculture or drained, I guess, for building the city of Fargo and Grand Forks or that kind of stuff. So also wetlands, they help spread the water out over a large area, and then it slowly releases that water back into the environment. And as it slowly releases it, tributaries and rivers will have their water flow peaks at different times, so that everything's not peaking at once and causing a major flood. And if you kind of look at the graphics, the one on the left is the one with intact wetlands, and you can see that the wetlands are storing water, and you can see the historic natural river channel through there. And then if you look on the right, the wetlands have been filled in, and there are no wetlands, and all of that water has been directly released into that river, and you can see the house along that river is flooded. All right, third benefit of wetlands is they improve water quality. So wetlands have a lot of plant material, so they will, all plants like fertilizers and excess fertilizers and nutrients. So any extra fertilizers or nutrients from manure that is put on lawns or farm fields, those wetland plants will use up those excess nutrients and slowly release it back into the environment. Also slows the water down enough so some of those contaminants and other pollutants can settle out. So, and because wetlands improve water quality and filter out contaminants, they are sometimes referred to as nature's kidneys. So in your body, your kidneys filter out waste materials, and that's what our wetlands are sometimes compared to. Fourth one is they contribute to recharging groundwater. So because wetlands slow water down and hold water in that area for a while, they slowly release the water as surface water, but they also hold it and give the water a chance to seep and infiltrate into the soil, and will eventually soak down and recharge aquifers. And you can kind of see from this graph. And because of all these wetlands that we've lost, there are, especially not quite so much in North Dakota, but maybe in other, but definitely in other areas of the United States, with the loss of wetlands, there is definitely aquifers that are not being recharged at the rate that they should be. So groundwater recharge. And number 5 is public use. Whether you realize it or not, we like wetlands because they're pretty. We can watch birds. Many people use them for hunting, fishing, trapping, swimming in lakes and boating. Those are all some of the ways that the public uses wetlands as well. And because of that public recreational use, that's also brings in any revenue from that public use is put towards conservation and managing wetlands. All right, so the next one up is threats to wetlands. So our wetlands, because they've often been seen as a wasteland, there hasn't been they've been drained, and we've lost a lot of wetlands in the last 100 years. For example, in North Dakota, our landscape used to be about 11% of our landscape was wetlands. We've lost almost half of that wetland area, either to development or draining, or just filling it in. So draining and developing wetland area is a threat to wetlands. The second one is sedimentation. So erosion over farm fields and bare land will pick up and carry soil particles into the wetlands. And as the plants slow that water down, the water doesn't have the energy to hold those soil particles, and those soil particles will drop out in the wetland. And eventually that soil buildup will fill in the wetland and harm the habitat. And you can kind of see on this middle picture, I tried to find one, and here's some equipment, and it's trying to dig out some of that extra sediment because that wetland is completely filled in. The third one is nutrification and eventually eutrophication. So again, through runoff, picking up excess nutrients and washing it into wetlands, that makes algae blooms and so on a whole lot worse. And eventually, with all those nutrients being carried into the water, it could lead to eutrophication. And I talked a little bit about eutrophication in the water chemistry training session from a few weeks ago. So if you don't remember what eutrophication is, you can look back at the water chemistry training session. And lastly, aquatic nuisance species. These are non-native organisms that have been introduced into our waterways or into the environment, and those will outcompete our native species for food, space, oxygen, and sunlight. So this is just 4 threats that I'm listing here of threats to our wetlands. So just kind of to wrap up the wetland portion of this talk is wetlands are some of the most productive and diverse ecosystems in the world. And if these are changed or destroyed, again, that's part of our whole ecosystem. So that'll cause issues, kind of a domino effect throughout the whole ecosystem. And a lot of times people say, well, maybe we could just rebuild a wetland somewhere else. And it takes hundreds of years for a wetland to form. So even the man-made wetlands that we construct to replace some of the lost wetlands, they're still not as good as what it took nature hundreds of years to build. So that's why it's really important to conserve our wetlands. All right, so we're going to switch gears now to groundwater. And groundwater, as a definition of groundwater, that is the water found between the spaces in between the particles underground. And then groundwater is sometimes confused with aquifer, but the aquifer is the underground bed of saturated soil and rock. All right, so groundwater is the water that's found. The aquifer is the storage area that holds the water. And some aquifers are hundreds of square miles and hundreds of feet thick, whereas others might only be a lot smaller. So aquifers can be really big or really small. So there's an aquifer in the south central United States that takes up several states. But yet there are others that are much smaller. And of course, how much water and what quality of water varies greatly in between those aquifers. So if we look at groundwater, water can be in an aquifer for sometimes only a few days. Other water within an aquifer might have been there for hundreds of thousands of years. So and that really basically depends on how confined the aquifer is. What is the surrounding substrate or earth around it? So the next slide will kind of dig a little bit more into these. But first up, how does groundwater move? When I was a kid, I used to think groundwater and aquifers were basically just a big underground cavern. And that's not really at all what they are. It's basically just water filling the spaces between soil and rock particles. But groundwater does move, it does flow, and that groundwater flow and movement is driven by, oopsie, sorry, is driven by gravity, the pressure of the gravity from the earth, what's the elevation and slope, and the pressure of the overlying, I'm sorry, water and earth materials. So gravity and pressure is what influences groundwater movement. All right, next up. So I was saying how aquifers are made up of different rock and soil material, and as the water moves through those substrates, it moves differently through different types of substrate depending on their size, basically particle size. So porosity is the measure of the voids in between the rock that are capable of filling with water, and the permeability is the ability of how porous is that material that allows water to flow through it. So if you think gravel has very large particles, so water can move really easily through that. As particle size gets smaller, the porosity and permeability gets a lot less. And the next slide really shows that. So you can kind of see if you go down, it kind of starts from the highest with gravel and goes down. As you go down through gravel, sand, silt, clay, the soil particles are getting closer and closer together, and so does the permeability. And once you get to shale and rock, those are very, very impermeable. So aquifers in between those layers would be considered to be confined, because there's just very little movement in between those soil types. A couple other terms, the water table, that's the top line. It's the top of an unconfined water area. So everything below that is saturated with water. The area above it might contain water. Those soil particles and pockets in between the soil particles probably do contain water, but they're not saturated yet. So that's not considered the water table. And the other term is the cone of depression. So when we put wells into the ground and into an aquifer and start withdrawing water, that changes the water table. And that area right adjacent to the well, the water table lowers in that immediate area, because that's the most immediate water that's being withdrawn from the aquifer. And this last slide is basically just kind of, I really like the graphic on here. This graphic came out of the Project WET, one of the lessons out of the Project WET curriculum. And Tina has that curriculum, and you can contact her if this is something you want to teach about and see these graphics more in depth. But again, this is just some definitions that we wanted you to know, and a graphic that shows them. So the confined aquifer is an aquifer that's basically sandwiched in between impermeable layers. And although water can get through those, it takes a very long time to get through those impermeable layers, and a lot of pressure to push them. The unconfined aquifers, they are not bound by the impermeable layer, and the top level of an unconfined aquifer is the top of the water table. And you can see there are zones of saturation, that's areas that are filled with water, and zones of aeration where there are still spaces and air pockets in between the soil particles. So kind of my quick overview of groundwater and some of the terms that we expect you to know associated with that. And to wrap it up, I'm going to send this list of YouTube links to Andrea, and she can post them on the website. But these are some supplemental YouTube videos that they're mostly about wetlands. There are a couple of them do talk about how wetlands are interconnected with groundwater. And although these videos were put together by the Connecticut Energy and Environmental Department, a wetland is a wetland no matter where you are. So whether you're in Connecticut, North Dakota, or the Amazon, wetlands still function the same way, and they still all have the same benefits. So each of these videos is between 10 and 15 minutes long. So not real long, but they pack a lot of information into those. And